In the early 1980s, a ground collision at Anchorage, Alaska, between a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 and a Piper PA-31 Navajo ultimately came to revolutionise the design and layout of airports and airfields all across the globe. But how in the first instance were two aircraft allowed to be on the same runway at the very same time? And how had supposedly robust, established procedures failed to mitigate just such a scenario? How had an apparently well-trained crew, comprising of not two but three pilots, failed in their efforts to adequately monitor their aircraft's position, and remarkably, while apprehensive, nonetheless chose to ultimately ignore those feelings, instead convincing themselves that all was as it should be? Stay with me while I provide a detailed account of how seemingly innocuous and harmless systemic failures, combined with elements of poor judgment and confirmation bias, very nearly cost the lives of 12 unsuspecting individuals on a miserable December afternoon in the Arctic North of America. December 83 was a bad month for aviation generally, with 4 accidents worldwide involving collisions on active runways, 2 of which occurred on the ground at Anchorage's International Airport in Alaska. In the first of these accidents on the 19th of the month, the Japan Airlines Boeing 747 was cleared to land on runway 06 right, without the tower controller realising that a ground operations vehicle conducting runway friction measurements had yet to vacate. With poor visibility conditions prevailing at the time, neither the tower controller nor the 747 crew were in a position to see the vehicle on the runway in advance of the aircraft touching down. It subsequently slammed into it from behind and completely destroyed it. Although no injuries were recorded on board the 747, the driver of the ground vehicle, although surviving the impact, suffered injuries which would ultimately require the amputation of both legs. Then, incredibly, only 4 days later, on the 23rd of the same month, disaster struck yet again. With the airport once more shrouded in fog, a Korean Airlines DC-10 bound for Los Angeles collided with a Piper PA-31 Navajo being operated by a local commuter airline, South Central Air. Although the accident resulted in no fatalities, it was nonetheless flagged as an example of how the absence of simple and pragmatic behavioural patterns had failed to trap and mitigate a crew's confusion and own self-doubt. It highlighted in the most dramatic of ways the human's propensity to see what was expected to be seen, and our collective tendency to force the observed world around us to conform to our cognitive expectations, the epitome of what is more commonly referred to as expectation bias. This is the complete story behind that collision, and the miraculous escape of all those involved. Anchorage International is located 5 miles or some 8 kilometres southwest of the city itself. The airport's orientation consists of 3 runways, 2 of which run parallel in a northeasterly-southwesterly direction, being identified as runways 06 right, 24 left, and 06 left, 24 right. Of the 2, 06 left, 24 right is slightly the shorter and wider at 10,600 feet long and 200 feet wide, the equivalent of 3,200 metres by 60, as compared to 06 right, 24 left at 10,897 feet by 150, the equivalent of 3,300 metres by 45. It is also the older, rougher and more fragile construction, having been first laid way back in the late 1940s. In fact, in order to protect it as much as possible, the airport authority had imposed an operational weight restriction, being applicable during the seasonal periods where the ground wasn't frozen. This effectively restricted operation on the runway during these times to all but the lightest of aircraft, specifically those of less than 12,500 pounds in weight, or the equivalent of just over 5,500 kilos. To the north of these 2 parallel runways lies runway 1432, being orientated in a southeast-northwest direction. It's actually the shortest of the 3 runways, by a very small margin at just under 10,500 feet long and 150 feet wide, and, with favourable winds, is usually designated the departure runway for larger jet traffic. With regard to the taxiways at the airport, All were equipped with standard taxiway edge lighting and yellow markings. Taxiway guidance signage was of the standard 18-inch sign face with 12-inch high legend, featuring black lettering on a yellow background. Of note, and a point which would ultimately play a not insignificant part in the events of the day, was the fact that runway identification signage shared common shape, colour and dimensional characteristics as those of the taxiway signs, despite the fact that the purpose of their installation was fundamentally different, in highlighting to the crews the fact that they were about to enter or cross a runway surface as opposed to a simple taxiway. On the day in question, as already mentioned, the meteorological conditions at Anchorage would have been considered poor by any measure. The surface weather observation taken at 13:50 local, just over 15 minutes prior to the accident, noted a light breeze from the southeast at 3 knots, an obscure sky with resultant visibility of 1/8 of a mile or 200 metres, and a punishingly cold outside temperature of 15 degrees Fahrenheit or -9 degrees centigrade. Real-time visibility readings taken adjacent to runway 06 right, known as RVR or runway visual range, indicated readings ranging from between 800 and 1200 feet, the rough equivalent of 240 to 360 metres. A further routine report made just after the accident at 14:15 local would indicate little change. In fact, the visibility would actually record a deterioration to 1/16 of a mile, or just 100 metres, with RVRs for runway 06 right showing little improvement above those previously reported. In other words, the airport was completely socked in with freezing fog. Describing conditions in a slightly more formal manner, the subsequent post-accident report submitted by official representatives of the Northern Weather Service stated,
"During the entire morning and early afternoon, we observed widespread heavy fog, with visibility conditions varying from 1/16 of a mile to 1 mile. Runway 06 right RVR conditions varied from 6,000 feet to as low as 800 feet, and sky conditions varied from thin obscured to totally obscured during the same time period. At the time I was notified of the accident, the weather conditions were sky totally obscured, visibility 1/16 of a mile in fog, wind 050 degrees at 3 knots, and 06 right RVR readings varying between 1,000 and 1,600 feet. The visibility and cloud cover were uniform in all directions from the observation point."
Left to deal with the conditions at hand were the respective crews of the 2 accident aircraft. The local commuter flight South Central Air Flight 59 was scheduled to make the short hop southwest from Anchorage to Kenai, a direct distance of no more than 66 miles or 106 kilometres. On board were a passenger complement of 8 and 1 single pilot, that being Captain Gary Holt, aged 33. Holt had joined the company only the previous month in November '83, and since being employed had logged 115 hours of flight time, bringing his grand total to just over 5,000 on the day of the accident. Some distance away at the cargo ramp of the International Satellite Terminal, the crew of Korean Air Flight 084 were at the same time preparing their DC-10 for the 2,300 mile or 3,800 kilometre trip south to Los Angeles in California. Although most production versions of the DC-10 were dedicated to a passenger configuration, in 1979 McDonnell Douglas began to also produce a dedicated freighter version. In between were a smaller grouping which could be converted back and forth, allowing the aircraft to operate in either a passenger or freighter configuration based on the operator's needs. Known as a DC-10-30CF, only 27 of the version were ever made, and it was one of these 27 which was scheduled to operate as Korean Airlines Flight 084 on the day in question. Being currently in its freighter configuration, the jet would operate the planned trip to Los Angeles with only its 3 Korean cockpit crew members on board. In command of this 3-man crew would be one Captain Bun Ki Lee, age 48, with a total of just over 12,500 hours under his belt. He had logged just over 2,200 hours of this time in the cockpit of the DC-10, nearly 1,800 of which had been in the left-hand seat as commander. his experience of operation into and out of Anchorage was significant, having completed a total of 73 landings and 78 takeoffs over the previous 8.5 years. Occupying the right-hand seat was his co-pilot for the trip, First Officer Bong Hyo Cho, age 51. His total flying experience amounted to just over 8,000 hours, just under 3,000 of which having been logged on the DC-10. Similar to Lee, Chow was well acquainted with operating in and out of Anchorage, having completed a total of 66 takeoff and landings in the 4 years or so he had been employed with the airline. The third member of the crew and overseeing the engineers panel to the rear of the DC-10's cockpit was Flight Engineer Myung Ko Lee, age 34. His total experience amounted to just over 2,000 hours, only 184 of which had been obtained on the type. Understandably, given his significantly lesser experience, his familiarity with Anchorage had only amounted to a total of 6 landings and 5 takeoffs. Just after noon, having started his engines, Holt requested and was granted airways clearance to his destination, Kenai. However, given the prevailing conditions at the time, controllers at Anchorage advised that he should expect a delay of approximately 30 minutes before being allowed to commence taxi for takeoff, rather than sit on the ramp with the Navajo's engines running for all that time. Holt instead decided to shut down and deplane his passengers back into the terminal building, where they might be more comfortable passing the time. Reboarding approximately 20 minutes later, Holt again called clearance delivery, who cleared him to start at his own discretion, but advised that he called ground in order to coordinate taxi before doing so. However, when he did, he was informed that conditions hadn't improved significantly to allow that to happen. So, for the moment, like it or not, he was going nowhere. Regulations required that he have a minimum of 1,800 feet, or the equivalent of 550 metres RVR, in order to allow an attempt to take off, with current readings being significantly below that value. However, over the next hour or so, conditions did slowly begin to improve, and so, having finally started engines at almost 140 that afternoon, Holt again requested, and was this time subsequently given taxi clearance to proceed to runway 06 left. As he progressed, about 4 minutes after commencing taxi, he reported to the ground controller his passing of the approach end of runway 32, and again on reaching intersection Whiskey 3, which coincides with the threshold of runway 06 left, some 60 seconds after that. Having been handed over to the tower controller, he reported that he was ready for departure once the necessary improvement in visibility had been achieved.
Tower, South Central 59. We're ready for departure runway 06 left once the RVR comes up to 1,800.
South Central 59. We're not quite there yet. We've got 1,000 at the moment. I'll let you know when it comes up.
While this interaction was taking place in the tower frequency, on the initial clearance delivery frequency, the crew of Korean 084 were now calling for their clearance to Los Angeles.
Ground Korean Air 084, we're ready for starting.
Korean Air 084 Heavy. Roger, you're cleared to start engines at your discretion. Plan on runway 32 or 06 right.
Per regulation, a visibility of 1/4 of a mile or 400 metres was required for the DC-10's departure from runway 32. Yet in contrast, a minimum RVR of only 600 feet or 180 metres for all 3 reporting points along 06 right was required in order to make it suitable. Having the least restrictive requirements of the 2 runways, and with the tower controller having already reported an RVR of 1,000 feet or 300 metres to Holt in South Central 59, one would have assumed that Lee would have seen it, that being 06 right, as the obvious choice for departure. Yet, for some unknown reason, perhaps believing it would expedite his departure, he instead chose runway 32, despite the fact that fog sitting on it made operations only just about legal.
Roger, we would like runway 32.
In response, the ground controller instructed Korean 084 to taxi to runway 32, and to report once established on the east-west taxiway, which ran parallel to, but just north of runway 06 left.
Korean Air 084 Heavy. Report entering the east-west taxiway.
First Officer Chow subsequently made the requested report 2 minutes later at 14:01, with the ground controller instructing Korean 084 to hold short of runway 32 before handing the flight over to the tower.
Anchorage ground, Korean Air 084 entering the east-west taxiway.
A Korean Air 084 Heavy Roger. Hold short of runway 32 and contact the tower on 1183. G'day.
But Chow's determination of where they were was incorrect, with visibility across the airfield now generally being reported as 1/8 of a mile, a mere 200 metres. What no one knew was the fact that the crew of Korean 084 had become disorientated and actually missed the entry to the east-west taxiway, instead continuing in a more or less straight line towards the active runway 06 left, which now lay directly ahead of them. From this point on, without any awareness on the part of the Korean crew, the tower controller, or indeed Holt and the Piper Navajo, a series of subtle, undetected errors conspired to put the DC-10 and the much smaller Piper on a collision course, which was now a mere 3 minutes away. Without the benefit of ground radar and blinded by the prevailing conditions, the tower controller was forced to accept Chow's position report for what it was, and thus, having no reason to believe otherwise, he instructed the crew of Korean 084 to taxi into position and hold on runway 32.
Korean Air 084 Heavy, taxi into position and hold. Runway 32.
Chow acknowledged the clearance, but the reality was that the DC-10 was now diverging away from runway 32, and instead approaching the intersection of taxiway Whiskey 1 and runway 06 left, with all concerned completely unaware of the fact. At 14:03 and 39 seconds, the tower controller requested Holt in South Central 59 to confirm his position, which he did as holding short of runway 06 left at the Whiskey 3 intersection.
South Central 059. What intersection are you at?
Whiskey 3, South Central 59.
In his mind's eye, the tower controller had a mental image of Korean 084 lining up on runway 32, while some distance still further away, the Piper continued to hold short of runway 06 left. As such, at 14:04 he cleared Korean 084 for takeoff, with First Officer Chow acknowledging the clearance.
Korean Air 084 Heavy. Runway 32 cleared for takeoff. Surface wind 050 degrees at 3 knots. Advise this frequency when airborne.
Roger, Korean Air 084 cleared for takeoff. We'll call you airborne.
With the RVR readings for runway 06 left now coincidentally indicating 1800 feet, 550 metres. Just after releasing Korean 084 for takeoff, the tower controller turned his attention to South Central 59, instructing Holt to line up on 06 left, in anticipation of his departure. At 14:06, First Officer Chow transmitted the fact that the DC-10 had started its takeoff roll, incredibly nearly 2.5 minutes after clearance had been issued. So why the long delay? Understandably, conditions at the field were poor, but it's only after listening to the captain's post-accident account that one gets a true understanding of what was really going on in the DC-10's cockpit during those critical couple of minutes.
우리는 13개의 지역에서 북쪽 경사로를 떠났고
We left the north ramp at 1357 local and were instructed to taxi to runway 32. On leaving the ramp and turning the aircraft to the left, I had difficulty seeing the yellow taxi line and so widened out my turn. After that, I managed to glimpse it dimly through the heavy ice fog. While I was concentrating heavily on following the line, the tower advised me to go onto the east-west taxiway. I thought I saw the taxiway to my right and turned in that direction, thinking that I had entered it. The visibility was so poor that it was difficult to see the taxiway markings. As I continued to taxi, my first officer confirmed that the north-south taxiway was to our right, and so we informed the tower that we were entering the east-west taxiway. Initially, he instructed us to hold short of runway 32, before shortly afterwards instructing us to taxi into position and hold. I turned the aircraft to the right, believing that I was aligning it with runway 32, and stopped. Due to the poor visibility, I felt unsure that the aircraft was actually on the correct runway. I looked for identifying markings, but could not see any. I discussed this with my first officer, who felt sure that we were on the correct runway. After 3 to 4 minutes of discussion, I considered taking runway 06 right because of my uncertainty. However, the size and lighting appeared to be correct, so I decided to take off. 6 to 7 seconds after beginning our takeoff roll, I saw the other aircraft directly in front of us. I knew that a head-on collision would be fatal for the people on board both planes. So I turned slightly to the left and lifted the nose of the aircraft. A moment later, I felt and heard the crash.
First Officer Chow's recollection was somewhat similar, although significantly his account didn't convey the same level of reservation with regard to DC-10's position on the airfield.
Ground control gave us a choice between runway 32 or 06 right. After Captain Lee and I discussed the options, we decided on runway 32 and informed the controller of our decision, who then switched us over to tower. On contact with the tower controller, he instructed us to tell him when we had entered the east-west taxiway. In spite of the poor visibility, we advanced and were able to get onto it, after which he instructed us to hold short of runway 32. Shortly afterwards, we were instructed to line up and take off. After checking power and going through the checklist, we advised the tower that we were rolling, and he acknowledged. When the aircraft's speed reached about V1, I caught sight of a small aircraft about 15 meters in front of us, and almost instantly heard and felt the crash. It seems that I lost my sense of direction due to the heavy ice fog, and I confused the east-west taxiway with the north-south one.
Chow's post-accident analysis was indeed correct. Disorientated by the thick fog, the crew of Korean 084 had indeed missed the entry to the east-west taxiway. The taxiway which would have brought them straight to the threshold of runway 32. Instead, they had inadvertently continued straight ahead on taxiway Whiskey 1, which would ultimately bring them not to runway 32 as intended, but rather runway 24 right, the opposite end of 06 left, the runway which Holt and his passengers had just entered. As Captain Lee finally released the DC-10's brakes, believing that he was beginning his takeoff roll down runway 32, he was in fact accelerating down the length of runway 24 right, on a direct collision course with South Central 59, Captain Holt and his 8 unsuspecting passengers. As he bore down on it, finally catching sight of the Piper through the fog, Lee instinctively knew that it was too late to avert a collision, so in desperation he instead attempted to rotate the DC-10 into the air, while applying left rudder as he did so. This caused the massive jet to yaw to the left, with the centre and main body gear swinging in the opposite direction, out to the right of the runway centre line. As his aircraft passed directly overhead the Piper, Lee's actions resulted in the centre and left main gears straddling the Navajo's fuselage, with the nose gear passing over its roof. Although this act of desperation was successful in deflecting the worst of the impact force, the collision was in itself unavoidable. Holt's post-accident recollection made for a sobering read.
The fog was pretty dense. I was told to taxi into position and hold waiting for the Korean Airlines jet to depart off 32. I heard him being cleared for takeoff. Then, some 30 to 40 seconds later, I saw headlights coming in our direction. Initially, I thought it must have been a vehicle on the runway, but then the lights just kept getting bigger and bigger, moving faster and faster. I ducked below the cockpit glare shield and told my passengers to do the same. Then I felt the impact.
Given the difference in all-up relative weights between the two aircraft, at 6,500 pounds or nearly 3,000 kilos for the Piper, as compared with the near 503,000 pounds or 228,000 kilos of the DC-10, it was reasonable to expect that any potential conflict between the two would see the commuter aircraft come off worst. Yet in reality, that wasn't what actually transpired. Indeed, the damage to the Piper was substantial. Its right wing was immediately sheared off at the root by the DC-10's left main body gear, with the jet's centre body gear shearing off the left wing outboard of the engine nacelle, with the upper part of the Piper's vertical stabiliser also being sheared off. The light twin was pushed 125 feet or 38 metres rearward along the runway, while still remaining on the paved surface, coming to rest on its nose and left main landing gear and aft portion of the fuselage. As for the DC-10, however, with insufficient speed and the force of the impact itself preventing it from getting airborne, it continued off the departure end of runway 24 right, demolishing a large part of the approach lighting structure for the reciprocal runway 06 left, passing on through a wooded area and down a gully, whilst slewing to the right before eventually coming to a stop just over 1,400 feet or 425 metres from the end of the runway, and 40 feet or 12 metres to the north of the extended centre line. As it did so, the jet's fuel tanks were compromised and a fire erupted, completely engulfing the fuselage. Although the initial fire was contained, it reignited periodically over the next 3 days, ultimately resulting in the complete destruction of the aircraft's structure in the area above the cabin floor. Despite the brutal force of the impact, miraculously the collision had resulted in no fatalities. Of all those involved, it was actually the crew of the DC-10 who had fared worst, being hospitalised in the aftermath for a period of 2 weeks, whilst the occupants of the Piper, thanks in no small part to Lee's quick thinking in slewing the jet slightly sideways as it passed overhead, all escaping with relatively minor injuries. As news of the collision started to filter out to the wider world, the obvious questions as to how such a tragedy could happen were starting to be asked. Undoubtedly, the prevailing environmental conditions had played their part. Yet this was the second serious collision at Anchorage International within the past week. Could it possibly be that there was more to it than a simple case of a crew becoming disorientated and losing situational awareness? In investigations of this nature, recovery of the respective flight data and cockpit voice recorders becomes a priority. But in the accident of Korean 084 and South Central 59, this was to prove problematic. Firstly, neither device had ever been fitted to the Piper, as regulations governing such equipment exempted light, smaller general and commuter aircraft such as the PA-31. While in the case of the DC-10, although fitted, examination would reveal that the aircraft's flight data recorder had actually failed on the previous inbound flight into Anchorage, and subsequent maintenance efforts to rectify the problem had been unsuccessful. In other words, although 25 hours of previous recordings were accessible, the events of the accident flight were not. As for the cockpit voice recorder, it was consumed in the post-crash fire and was never recovered. Although this outcome would be disappointing and undoubtedly frustrating, the investigation team found resourceful ways to work around the problem. What was known was the fact that South Central 59 had arrived at the intersection of Whiskey 3 and runway 06 left at 13:44 local, with Korean 084 commencing its taxi at 13:55, some 11 minutes later. The investigation team then subsequently examined all possible taxi routes which the DC-10 could have taken. A transcript of recorded communication between the tower and pilots of both aircraft was zero-timed to the start of the DC-10's taxi. Using a small general aviation aircraft, they taxied at a speed comparable to that of the airliner, while the transcript was read out aloud. The aircraft first retraced the routing from the international cargo ramp to the intersection of runway 06 left and taxiway Whiskey 1, then repeated the process from the same parking position by way of various potential routings to the threshold of runway 32. As a result of their efforts, the best correlations they could identify in relation to time and position was accomplished with the following route. They were strongly of the belief that the DC-10 had made a turn to the left on commencement of taxi, in the order of 240 degrees to a largely southerly heading, and continued to progress in that direction along the western edge of the parking apron. Subsequently, they believed that Korean 084 had made a turn of about 60 degrees to the right of the taxiway Whiskey 1. rather than the 100 degrees or so which would have been necessary in order to position the jet on the east-west taxiway. The timing of this turn corresponded with the erroneous transmission from First Officer Chow to the effect that the aircraft had entered the east-west taxiway, which in hindsight they had not, as the aircraft continued on taxiway Whiskey 1 in a general southwesterly direction. As it actually passed the entrance to the east-west taxiway, First Officer Chow transmitted the Korean 084 was proceeding to the holding point of runway 32. Finally, in acknowledging their clearance to enter the departure runway, turning 50 degrees to the right, Lee and his crew, believing that they were aligning themselves with runway 32, were in fact actually positioning the DC-10 on the centre line of runway 24 right, setting the stage for their ultimate collision with Holt and the Piper. Had the aircraft actually been on the east-west taxiway, the turn to align itself with runway 32 would have been in the order of 100 degrees, and not the 50 degrees or so which had been executed. Yet nobody on the flight deck of the DC-10 had obviously picked up on that fact. But irrespective of the Piper's position on the reciprocal end of the runway, with the distance from the intersection of runway 24 right and taxiway Whiskey 1 to the threshold of runway 06 left being given as just 2,400 feet, or just over 730 metres, the prevailing conditions and gross weight of the jet meant that an actual ground run of 8,150 feet, or just under 2,500 metres, would actually have been required in order for it to get airborne, and that simply didn't exist, meaning that even without the Piper's involvement, a high-speed overrun with disastrous consequences was, at this stage, inevitable. 3 minutes and 21 seconds later, having been cleared for takeoff, Chow announced that the DC-10 was commencing its takeoff roll. Although runway 24 right was slightly wider than runway 32, the difference in perspective would not have been readily identifiable from the DC-10's cockpit, particularly given the environmental conditions at the time. Furthermore, both runways were fitted with high-intensity runway edge lights, which would have meant that both would have looked remarkably similar from a visual perspective. But what of the airport's signage and markings? Despite the obvious poor environmental conditions at the time, surely there should have been some useful indication to the crew as to their location on the airfield. In this regard, the investigation team's findings proved to be both enlightening and concerning. At the time of their airfield observations, there had been no precipitation or above freezing temperatures at the airport since the accident itself. The surface of runway 24 right 06 left was found to have been covered with a thin layer of snow, frost and ice, which had obliterated the white all-weather runway markings. With regard runway 32, it was observed to have been covered with similar contaminants. However, due to its predominant usage as the preferable departure runway for the larger jet aircraft, its markings were visible for about the first 1,000 feet or 300 metres, due in large part to the jet blast from these aircraft literally stripping away these layers of contamination. Similarly, the relevant taxiways of Whiskey 1, Whiskey 3 and November 1 were all likewise found to be in a similar condition, with no taxiway surface markings being visible. With regard to the airfield signage, it was noted that some of the taxiway and runway identification boards were either completely or partially unlit. Significant was the information board located at the exit of the ramp area, which, in indicating the direction to the respective runways of 06 left, 06 right, and runway 32, was not only ambiguous in its design, but of the 7 lights installed to illuminate it, only 3 were found to be in working order. Likewise, the information board warning of entry into runway 24 right 06 left, although adequately illuminated, was nonetheless observed to be very dirty, to the extent that contrast between its lettering and background had been compromised sufficiently to have made identification difficult, particularly given the environmental conditions which existed at the time. As mentioned previously, the similarity in design between taxiway and runway signage certainly made identification of one's location in the airfield a lot more challenging than it should have been, with both sets of signage sharing a common shape, dimensional characteristics and colour, that being black lettering on an amber background. Given this continuity in shape, size and colour, The investigation team were concerned that in the future, under similar environmental conditions, other flight crew or ground ops vehicles may well repeat this crew's error and inadvertently enter an active runway. They would thus subsequently recommend that runway and taxiway signs should be fundamentally different in their appearance, which indeed is the case today, whereby runway identification signs consist of white text on a red background, whereas the modern taxiway sign retains the black text on amber background format, with additional current location signs adopting the reverse depiction of amber lettering on a black background. The challenges in identifying this signage were undoubtedly exaggerated by the fundamental design of the DC-10, with its cockpit being positioned some 30 feet or 9 meters above ground level, a fact which only acted to increase the slant range visibility from observer to sign. Furthermore, this geometry would also have acted in a way so as to distort a pilot's sense of motion, particularly under such conditions of reduced visibility. As such, the investigation team were of the belief that the crew of 084 may well have experienced difficulty in distinguishing between what was required and what was achieved in the context of the respective turns onto both taxiway and runway, given the limited external visual cues which were available. Due to the prevailing conditions, the crew of Korean 084 had essentially been forced to taxi their aircraft in the absence of external aids, which they would have normally taken for granted. Surface markings were all but obscure, while the depiction and illumination of airport signage was not much better. With the tower controller unable to visually monitor their progress, and the airport not having ground movement radar installed, more than ever, the onus was on the crew themselves to be all the more attentive to their aircraft's progress, and this meant using all available aids at their disposal. But in this regard, the final accident report makes a stunning and damning observation.
It is difficult to understand, however, why Captain and First Officer, following some discussion about runway uncertainty, did not use their directional gyros or the aircraft's standby compass to orientate themselves with regards to the aircraft's heading, especially after aligning it with what they believed was runway 32. Considering that these discussions had lasted for a full 2 to 3 minutes, had any of the flight crew checked the heading indicators during this time, it would have been very apparent before commencement of the takeoff roll that the aircraft was in fact on the wrong runway.
Although Korean Airlines standard operating procedures didn't require such confirmation prior to departure, the practice was and is nonetheless commonplace with many other operators, particularly during periods of low visibility operations. In truth, procedures aside, what we're talking about here is good airmanship, plain and simple. But in this regard, Captain Lee and his crew had been found wanting. The simple fact of the matter was that a discrepancy of nearly 80 degrees between their actual and expected headings simply hadn't been noticed by any of the 3 pilots on the flight deck. The failure of Korean Airlines to formally stipulate that their pilots should continuously verify the aircraft's heading during such adverse environmental conditions was, the investigation team believed, perhaps indicative of their assumption that such action would be of such a rudimentary nature so as to make any such stipulation unnecessary. While such a belief may well have been reasonable and reflective of accepted practice, that this experienced crew had failed to carry out such a fundamental cross-check was nonetheless extremely worrying, potentially indicative, they believed, of underlying training deficiencies within the airline. Given all that they had learned, it was easy to understand the investigation team's incredulity. Specifically with regard to Captain Lee's performance, his post-accident statement revealed that he had allowed his first officer's more recent experience of operation to Anchorage to adversely influence his decision-making process. Unlike his captain, Chow had manifested no uncertainty about the aircraft's location, and it was his conviction and apparent confidence, misplaced though it was, which apparently had convinced Lee to continue with commencement of the takeoff roll, against what in hindsight was his better judgment. The NTSB had in the past advocated for improved assertiveness training for more junior pilots. However, there was also a clear responsibility for commanders to exercise a positive overall management of their subordinates. In this instance, however, they believed that this crew concept had effectively broken down, and this ultimately was a reflection on the man in charge. Yet for all their criticism of Lee and his management of the aircraft's movement on the ground, They also acknowledged the fact that had he not applied left rudder as he lifted the DC-10's nose into the air, then in all likelihood either or both of the jet's nose and or centre main body gears would have struck the fuselage of the smaller aircraft, more than likely resulting in the fatality of all those in the Piper, and quite probably the DC-10 as well. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of the accident was the failure of the Korean Airlines captain to follow accepted procedures while taxiing, resulting in him becoming disorientated. His failure to use the aircraft's compass to confirm his direction of travel, and his ultimate decision to take off while still unsure as to whether the aircraft was actually on the correct takeoff runway or not. Contributing to the accident were the low visibility conditions prevailing at the time, which impeded both his and the tower controller's ability to accurately assess the aircraft's position on the airport. In addition, the illegibility of some taxiway and runway signage was also cited as being problematic. On foot of their exhaustive investigation, the NTSB had conclusively established that as Korean 084 taxied away from the International Cargo Terminal, the route which the aircraft had taken had been devoid of any signage which would have indicated to the crew that they had inadvertently entered taxiway Whiskey 1, nor that the first intersection they were to come across was actually that of their intended route of travel, that being the intersection of the east-west taxiway with their current position on Whiskey 1. In other words, Lee and his crew had absolutely no external source of information to conclusively verify their aircraft position, making the trapping and ultimate correction of their error virtually impossible, particularly given the fact that they were failing to monitor in real time the aircraft's heading. As such, they would ultimately make the following recommendations. Firstly, that airport authorities ensure that all runway and taxiway entrances and intersections are appropriately signposted. Secondly, that the graphics of these signs be standardized and of a sufficient size to enable them to be legible to pilots under all meteorological conditions. Furthermore, that these signs be uniquely designed for the specific information they are intended to portray. In other words, a dedicated format should be found for each sign type so that a clear distinction exists between taxiway and runway signage. The lighting installed to illuminate these signs should be inspected and maintained at regularly defined intervals. And finally, that air carriers should focus on specific training requirements aimed at improving crews' situational awareness while taxiing under low visibility conditions. Specifically, with regard to Anchorage International, following the accident, the airport authority did review and improve signage along the DC-10's known route of travel, with the industry as a whole embracing the NTSB's recommendation in relation to signage design, so that today, ground operations across the globe are far less challenging, and thus, by association, a hell of a lot safer. Such is the legacy of Korean Airlines Flight 084 and the Anchorage ground collision, which although thankfully resulted in no fatalities, nonetheless made a significant contribution to overall aviation safety.